You know, when we look back on 2023, one thing is going to stand out: climate extremes. We're talking about fires that stretched across entire continents and floods that were just devastating. It was the year that really showed us, right in our faces, how fragile our planet has become. All those predictions about a climate crisis, well, they're not predictions anymore. They're here. And that brings us to this really stark warning. It kind of sets the stage for everything we're going to talk about today. It's this powerful, almost chilling reminder that what used to feel like some distant problem, well, it's our reality now. And what we're seeing is this chain reaction, a series of events all connected, happening all over the globe. So where do we start the story? We're going to begin in Canada's boreal forest. Now, this isn't just, a bunch of trees. It's one of the planet's most crucial carbon sinks. Think of it like a giant sponge soaking up CO2 from the air. So you can imagine, when a place like that burns, it's not just about losing trees. It actually threatens the stability of our entire climate. Okay, so wildfires? They're actually a pretty natural part of this forest's life cycle. But 2023 was something else entirely. It was different. You see, after one of the driest rainy seasons ever recorded, and you throw in rising temperatures on top of that, well, the forest floor basically became a tinderbox. All the fuel was there, just waiting for a spark. And boy, did it get a spark. That spark led to this unbelievable number. By May of 2023, 25 million acres of forest had already burned across Canada. Let that sink in. That's an area bigger than the entire country of Portugal. And here's the kicker. Instead of soaking up carbon like it's supposed to, the burning forest was now pumping massive amounts of it into the atmosphere. It flipped from being a carbon sink to a carbon source, basically pouring fuel on the fire of this vicious cycle. But behind a massive number like that, there are always personal tragedies. This is the story of Devon Gale, who was just 19 years old. She was out there with her siblings doing the hard work of clearing brush to try and stop a fire from spreading when she got trapped under a fallen tree. She became the very first victim of Canada's 2023 wildfire season, just a devastating reminder of the real human cost of all this. And, the impact of these fires wasn't felt equally across the board. Take Carol Johnston. She lost her home in the East Prairie Métis settlement, and her story sadly points to a much larger trend. It's the Indigenous communities, whose entire lives and culture are so deeply woven into the land, who are being hit the hardest. Their heritage is quite literally going up in smoke. But the story doesn't just end where the flames do. Not at all. The consequences, well, they traveled far, far beyond the forests. They were carried on the wind. And this is just how far-reaching that impact was. In June, a thick, heavy blanket of smoke from those Canadian fires drifted down and just descended on New York City. I mean, it turned the sky this surreal, almost post-apocalyptic orange. Suddenly, for millions of people, the climate crisis wasn't some abstract concept anymore. It was the actual air they were breathing. And it was toxic. And listen, New York wasn't the only one. We saw this in Chicago, Denver, Detroit, Milwaukee. The smoke cloud blanketed cities all across the United States. From the Midwest all the way to the Rocky Mountains, millions of Americans were dealing with these hazy skies and constant air quality alerts. It was this really abrupt, continent-wide wake-up call about how connected we all really are. Okay, so while North America is literally choking on smoke, a completely different kind of climate extreme was playing out across the Atlantic. Europe found itself in the grip of a heat wave that just shattered all the records. So what was causing this? Well, the culprit was this weather phenomenon that meteorologists pretty appropriately named Cerberus, after the three-headed dog from mythology. And it really did act like a monster. It was like putting a giant lid over the continent, trapping this intense heat for weeks. It turned these bustling cities and beautiful holiday spots into, well, a literal hell on earth. Just to give you an idea of how bad it was, in Rome, right outside the Colosseum, thermometers hit 45 degrees Celsius. That's about 113 Fahrenheit. Tourists were fainting in the streets, hospitals saw this huge surge in heat-related emergencies, and 23 cities had to be put on red alert. That basically means the heat was a direct threat to everybody, not just the vulnerable. And of course, with that kind of extreme heat comes fire. On the Greek island of Rhodes, things just escalated so fast. The heat wave hits on July 12th. Just 6 days later, on the 18th, fires break out. And then, only 4 days after that, 20,000 people, tourists and locals, had to be evacuated in what was just total chaos. The whole thing culminated in this awful tragedy on July 25th when 2 Air Force pilots lost their lives trying to fight those blazes. But look, extreme heat is only one side of the coin. On the other side of the world, the very same changes in our atmosphere were creating the exact opposite extreme. Not fire, but flood. As Europe burned, Asia was drowning. See, here's the thing about a hotter atmosphere. It's not just drier in some places, it's also wetter in others. A warmer atmosphere can hold way more moisture. And what that means is, when it finally does rain, it doesn't just rain, it pours, with an intensity that we are just not used to. The science behind this is actually pretty simple. For every single degree of warming, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more water. So with the 1.2 degrees of warming we've already experienced, you do the math. That's over 1 trillion extra tons of water vapor hanging out up there in the sky, just waiting for the right conditions to fall.
And this is exactly what happens when all that water comes down way too fast. In South Korea, they got monsoon rains that normally would fall over a couple of months, but instead it all came down in these intense bursts. Near a town called Osong, a riverbank couldn't hold anymore and it collapsed. This underpass, with 15 vehicles inside, flooded completely. And when I say completely, I mean it happened in under 2 minutes. There was just no time to escape.
But here's the cool, twisted paradox of our changing climate. While some places are literally drowning, other places are desperate for even a single drop of rain. So now, let's shift our focus to East Africa, where they are living through the complete opposite of this water crisis. Since 2020, the seasonal rains just haven't shown up. And this has plunged the entire region into the longest and most severe drought they have on record. We're talking about nearly 32 million people in Somalia and Ethiopia who are now in urgent need of life-saving help. They're facing what can only be described as catastrophic food insecurity. And this is where the profound injustice of this whole crisis really hits home. You look at countries like Somalia or Pakistan, which, remember, had its own historic, devastating floods back in 2022. Together, they contribute less than 1% of the global emissions that are driving all this chaos. Less than 1%. And yet, they are the ones on the front lines, bearing the absolute worst of the consequences. This whole situation is creating a new kind of displaced person. In Somalia alone, more than 1.3 million people have already been forced to just abandon their farms and move. We call them environmental refugees. They aren't fleeing a war or persecution, they're fleeing a climate that simply can't sustain them anymore. So let's just recap. We've gone from the burning forests of Canada to the flooded tunnels of Korea, from scorching cities in Europe to the parched lands of Africa. We've really seen a world that is being pushed to its absolute limits. And all of this brings us to one final and, I think, totally unavoidable question. When you see it all laid out like this, the burning forests, the flooded cities, the starving children, it just becomes so painfully clear that our world is changing, and it's changing in really dangerous ways. And so, after seeing all that, we have to wonder, are we really doing enough? That's the one question that connects every single story we've talked about. And honestly, it's a question that demands an answer from every single one of us.